So one of the things happened though, because on the way back, Amr kills a man from Sulaim that he finds, from Bani Amr. And the Prophet ﷺ actually says that they have to pay a blood writ, because he killed, the man was actually innocent. And the tribe, in fact, had not been treacherous. It was one man amongst the tribe that had been treacherous. The actual tribe had been faithful to Abu Bara's promise of protection. And so there was a blood writ, a diya, that had to be paid. Now, another thing that the Prophet ﷺ actually told the Sahaba, that Jibril informed him that these 70 men that were killed had asked Allah after they died. They said, رَبَّنَا بَلَّغْ قَوْمَنَا أَنَّا لَقِينَا رَبَّنَا فَرَضِينَا عَنْهُ وَرَضِيَ عَنَّا. They said, "Oh our Lord, tell our people after us that we have met our Lord and we are pleased with Him and He is pleased with us." And so the Prophet ﷺ told them that these shuhada had actually been able to give a message to them from the unseen world. Now, Bani Nadir, who, as we remember, there were three tribes, Bani Nadir, Bani Qaynuqa, and Bani Qurayza. And these were three Jewish tribes around Medina, and they had alliances with the Aus and with the Khazraj before Islam, and then when Islam came, they made alliance with the Prophet ﷺ. Now, one of the things, the Prophet ﷺ actually went to Bani Nadir because they had alliances with Bani Amr. So there was relationship there, and he wanted to ask them for help dealing with Bani Amr. And when he went, he took some of the companions there, and so they asked them to stay for a meal. Now, this man, Huyay ibn Akhtab, was a very powerful Jewish leader from Bani Nadir. He was very eloquent, and he was very forceful, and didn't take no for an answer. They actually planned to kill the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ was sitting with them, and as things were happening, he was told just to leave. He actually got up and just left and didn't say anything. And after that, the companions began to feel that they were worried, and they left. And when the Prophet informed them, he told them to go back to Bani Nadir and tell them that they had to leave. They'd broken their treaty with the Prophet ﷺ. And Ibn Maslama, who brought the news to them, he says, you're an Aus, we had ties with you, what's going on? And he tells them, تَغَيَّرَتِ الْقُلُوبِ, things aren't the same as they used to be. Times have changed. We're not with you anymore. We're with the Messenger of Allah. And so, basically, the Ibn Ubay promises, right, to help them, because he's telling them to stay and that he's going to help them. And so Huyay stays with his people, and they actually are in there. They have these fortresses just outside of Medina, and the days pass and nobody's coming to help. Bani Qurayza and their ruler was actually much better than Huyay, and Huyay will actually betray him, right? But he refuses to break the pact with the Prophet ﷺ. He said, we have a pact, we can't help you. And it was treacherous what you did. So basically, after a period, they finally surrender. And the Prophet ﷺ forces them to leave. And this is from Abdullah ibn Ubay, who was a confederate with them, begs the Prophet ﷺ not to harm them. And they actually leave. So the Prophet ﷺ does not kill them. And some of them, one of the things that he mentions in there is that they were very wealthy, and they'd made all their money off the Arabs, right? Because if you remember, they had the marketplace in Medina, and they'd become extremely wealthy from the Arabs. And the Arabs really never knew how wealthy they were, and this was a big shock to them, to see them leaving in with their caravans, because they took all their wealth with them, and they went out. And then what happens is one of the things that he mentions in there is that the Prophet ﷺ gave the land of Bani Nadir. They had a land right outside of Medina, and it was given to the immigrants. And this was important because the immigrants, many of them were still very poor. Now this is different from ghanima. You have fay and you have ghanima in Sharia. And this is fay. Fay is where you have no engagement of battle. There's no engagement. People just surrender. So that is not booty. That's called fay. It's like a gift from Allah. And that, the Prophet ﷺ was commanded in the Quran, وَمَا فَأَ اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْقُرَى فَلِلَّهِ وَلِلرَّسُولِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. So they were actually now another thing that happens here, the Prophet ﷺ, Zainab dies, Hussein is born, and Salama, who, if you remember, Abu Salama was direct relative of the Prophet ﷺ. He's the first to make hijrah, and he dies. And the Prophet ﷺ proposes to Salama. And actually Abu Salama made a dua for her that Allah would give her better than Abu Salama after her, a person who would never harm her or make her sad. And she said, Man khayrun min Abi Salama? Who's better than... She couldn't imagine anybody better than Abu Salama. And then the Prophet ﷺ proposed to her, so she knew his dua was answered. But she initially said, I'm an older woman, the best of my years are gone. She was actually only about 30. But in Arab culture, women tended to, women aged quickly in those cultures often, and in terms of childbearing years, the childbearing years were generally those early years, not necessarily, but generally. And she said also that she had children, and who were orphans now, and she was extremely jealous. And she didn't like the idea of being there with the other wives. So the Prophet ﷺ said, as for your age, I'm older than you. He said, as for your children, they'll find a good caretaker in me. And as for your jealousy, I'll make a dua that Allah remove it from your heart. And so she agreed to marry him. Now it's interesting here, Salama had helped Aisha with the wedding. Now one of the things, Aisha obviously hadn't looked at her as a potential co-wife, right? And so suddenly Aisha's actually a little worried. And she goes and sees Salama, and now she's convinced this woman is stunningly beautiful. She's really upset about it. She goes back to Zainab and she tells her, this woman is so beautiful, and the Prophet's going to be inclined towards him. And so Zainab went and she came back and she said, you're over-exaggerating. She's beautiful, but she's not like you're saying. In other words, because Aisha was very beautiful. So that's a little bit of sweet jealousy amongst the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. And then so she says she went back to see her again, and she realized Hafsa was right. She was over-exaggerating, but her jealousy was making her see things that weren't there. So now, really important event here. The next years come around. Abu Sufyan has promised to meet them at Badr. And this is a problem because they had a really bad year. There was no fodder for the animals, and the Qurayshis could not make it to Badr. They would have major problems. But they'd made this promise. So they convinced this man, Nu'aym al-Ashja'i, who's important, and he comes back in the Battle of Al-Khandaq. And they convince him, they promise him they'll give him 100 camels, convince the Prophet ﷺ not to go out. And then what they'll do is they'll pretend to go out, and then when they hear the Muslims haven't gone out, they'll go back and save face. So this is all posturing. So Nu'aym goes and he says, "Inna an-nas qad jama'u lakum fakhshawhum." That's from Nu'aym. He actually says that, which is revealed in the Quran. They've gathered up against you, and you should see them, huge numbers, and you should have fear of them. فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا. It increased them in iman, right? That it actually, and they فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. Allah's the best of, He's enough for us, and He's the best to protect us. And then they actually decide to go out with the Prophet ﷺ, and they have a nice time at Badr. They have, they kill animals, and there's a fair, and they actually benefit in these things. فَانْقَرَبُوا بِنِعْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَفَضْلٍ لَمْ يَمْسَسْهُمْ سُوءٌ. They come back from Medina after going to Badr with ni'mah from Allah, and no harm afflicted them. وَاتَّبَعُوا رِضْوَانَ اللَّهِ. And they followed the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by fulfilling their oaths and doing what the Messenger told them to do. And so, and one of the things he says in there is, because the Prophet was worried about going out because people were some of the Muslims were worried, he says in there that he'll go out even if he has to go alone. They all go out with him, 1,500 men, and they have camels and horses, and they bring merchandise, and so they benefited there. And then Abu Sufyan said to Quraysh, "Let's go out. If he doesn't go out, then..." So he actually doesn't end up going out, and then he's... the thing about Abu Sufyan, if you actually look at him, Abu Sufyan was thrust into a position of leadership because of the loss of all of the real leaders of Quraysh. They were lost at Badr, and he was the next one there. But he really, he wasn't prepared for this task, and he, you see on several occasions, he's really he's not living up to the leadership that the Quraysh expected, and that was one of the times. Another time, obviously, is at the Khandaq. Right, because he actually just tries to cut out before anybody leaves. So this is a problem. The Quraysh are really losing face now, and again, this is spreading all over the peninsula. The Muslims went out ready to fight Quraysh, and they didn't show up, and this is a very bad sign. Also, another thing that happens here is coming from Badr. In the beginning of the 5th Islamic year, which is beginning of summer in 626, Ghatafan were beginning to plan raids. And this was a tribe that was just outside of Medina, and they had been allied with Quraysh, planning against, and sometimes with the Jews. And so the Prophet ﷺ takes, their 400 men go out, and they basically disperse. But during that time, the prayer of Salat al-Khawf comes down, where a group pray and a group guard, and then they switch, like that. So Salat al-Khawf, in order for them to keep the prayer during these times. Now, and then he just mentions that story that Jabir ibn Abdullah mentioned about the mercy of Allah that happened during that point, which is about the bird that they brought, and the mother bird throwing herself at their hands in order to protect her young, and they were all amazed at that, and the Prophet used it as a teaching example to say the rahmah of Allah is greater than the rahmah for this bird's young fledgling. And then he also, the hadith about the rahmah being in 100 parts and only one part coming down. So all the mercy on the earth, including the mercy that animals have towards their creatures, are from that one portion of rahmah that comes down. And another thing on the way back, Jabir ibn Abdullah, who, if we remember, he's the man who was forced to stay behind to watch all of the children for his father, and his father's martyred, right, at Uhud. And the Prophet ﷺ is riding, and Jabir is really hitting his camel, but it's not going very fast, so he's delaying. The Prophet comes up behind him, and gives a whack to the camel. And the camel really starts moving after that. And he mentions that he actually had him go down. And then he hit him. And after that, nobody was faster than that camel. And so he asked him, why are you going so fast? He said, I just got married and I can't wait to go back to Medina. And the Prophet ﷺ said, did you marry a virgin? تُلَعِبُهَا وَتُلَعِبُكَ, that you can play with her and she can play with you. And he said, I married an older woman. And he said, why did you do that? And he said that my father was struck down, left me with 7 daughters, and I didn't want to bring in somebody like them. So the Prophet ﷺ said that asabta, you did the right thing, that it was a wise thing to do. And this is him thinking not just about himself, but about his responsibilities. And one of the things that he says in there is that they'd stop before going into Medina, so they get news, and he mentions to Jabir, we'll let them get news and she can clean up the pillows for you, like get ready for the house. And he says, we don't have any cushions in the house. And he said, you'll get them, inshallah. And so the thing that he does is he takes his camel there, and he did what the Prophet ﷺ told him. And then the Prophet weighed out an ounce of gold for him, paid him for the camel. He wanted to give the camel to the Prophet ﷺ, but he refused. And then when he gave him, after the exchange was done, he's walking away, and he said, Jabir, take the camel as well. So he was he wanted to give him something for his wedding without having him to feel that he was like getting charity. Another interesting event is that Salman, who's been working very hard for this Jewish Quraydi, taking care of his date palms, goes and he complains. He wants to be in on all the events that are happening, and he feels left out. So they make an agreement with this Jewish leader to pay. They'll plant all these date palms, but the Jewish leader he says, only when they actually bear fruit will I free him. So the Prophet ﷺ tells them, they bring all the shoots, and the Prophet ﷺ actually plants all of them. And he asks them each one to contribute. And one of the things that he does, he tells them to go, Salman, dig all the holes. And the Prophet actually went and planted all of them. And then they actually gave fruit that year, right, which is unheard of. So it was a mu'jiza of the Prophet ﷺ, except for one. So out of the 300, only one didn't. And he said, what's wrong with that? And Omar said, I planted that one. So the Prophet ﷺ had it dug up, and he planted it, and it came to fruition. And then he gave Salman money. So Salman is actually a freed. He's a mawla of the family, radiyallahu anhu. And then another event happens is the Prophet ﷺ made an incredibly fast move to Dumat al-Jandal, which is a place to the north where Bani Kalb was marauding. And they were actually hearing of threats of them coming up into Medina. And the Arabs were very shocked at how fast they did this. So they realize now that they're gaining an extraordinary amount of strength. And one of the things that the Prophet ﷺ, if you imagine here that the Messenger of Allah is not only teaching them all of their spiritual things, he's also a marriage counselor, he's doing things like taking care of Jabir's wedding house. I mean, he's really engaged in everything, but he's also a military leader. Right? So he really is at the head of this army. And every Muslim in Medina was part of his army. They were soldiers. And they were ready to go instantly. And Hamr al-Asad is a good example because they went out, with blood literally coming out of their wounds. So these people were completely ready to go at any time. And they were very frightened. When the kuffar saw this, they were actually extremely frightened of this. And he points out, which is extraordinary, you have to also remember that the Arabs, prior to this, all of their understanding was based on kinship bonds, marriage, and alliances that were based on mutual benefit. That's how they understood. And there was no way, because these were very flimsy alliances. They could fall apart very easily. And what they were seeing here is people from different tribes, and actually very shocking for them, Al-Aws wal Khazraj, who had been completely at each other's throats for as long as anybody could remember, they're all united. And Allah reminds them and tells the Prophet that it is Allah who united them. لَوْ أَنفَقْتَ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا مَا أَلَّفْتَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِهِمْ. Had you spent everything that was in the earth, you could not have binded these hearts together. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ أَلَّفَ بَيْنَهُم. Allah is the one that brought them together. So this is really an extraordinary thing for the Arabs to be witnessing. And he mentions there that one of the things that they often said, جَعَلْتُ فِدَاءَكَ, or أَبِي وَأُمِّي فِدَاءُكَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. My mother and father are a ransom for you. Right? Explaining what they would do. And then he also mentions, if you look also, the Prophet ﷺ, he, out of his 24-hour day, he was basically giving a third for worship, a third to the affairs of the government and his community, and then a third to his family, which included the time he would have slept. Right. So, very, very busy day that Allah obviously put incredible barakah in. And he would sometimes visit all of his wives in one night. So you can imagine, the barakah that was in his time and these things. Now, another thing, Qiyam al-Layl was part of their life there. And the Prophet ﷺ was actually, it was an obligation to pray at least 1/3 of the night. That was a fard on him. Just as he had certain dispensations from Allah that really, the Orientalist idea that him marrying more than 4 wives was a kind of perk is an absurdity, because one, had he wanted, the Prophet ﷺ could have very easily married 4, divorced 4, and married another 4, or done whatever he wanted, and people would have gladly given their daughters to the Prophet ﷺ. His marrying, some of his wives were very beautiful, and the Prophet ﷺ obviously loved them, and some of them were his own kinship bonds. Some of them were widows who he was not only honoring them, but honoring their martyred husbands. And then some of them, like Safiya and Juwayriyah, were women who there was an extraordinary benefit to the community at large in his marrying them. So the Prophet ﷺ was marrying these women, and there was incredible benefits that were coming from that for the community at large as well. Now, one of the things that he mentioned also was another problem in Medina, which was the growing animosity between the Jews and the other Muslims. And one of the Muslims here heard a Jew once swearing by Musa alayhi salam, who'd been chosen over all of humanity. And he became really angry, hit this man and said, "Will you say that in front of the Messenger of Allah?" And the Prophet ﷺ actually told them not to differentiate. One, even though the Prophet, he kind of indicates here that, there's no distinction, which is from the Quran, but the reality of it is there's no distinction in that they're all messengers from Allah, but there is a distinction in their maqam with Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ has the highest station with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he did not tell us to boast. Like, we shouldn't say to another religion, our prophet's better than yours, right? Because this is a childish type of, it's what little children do, right? So there's no point in that, and that's why the Prophet ﷺ told them not to do that. But we know that the Prophet ﷺ is better than all of the prophets in his station with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And another thing he mentions is the story of Handala. Handala was a Tamimi who was living in Medina. He went to Sayyidina Abu Bakr and he said, Nafaqa Handala. You know, Handala is a munafiq. And Abu Bakr said, why? And he said, because when I'm with the Messenger of Allah, I feel like the garden and the fire are present, and I have no desire to do anything other than serve Allah. And yet when I go away and go back to my work and my family, I begin to forget these things and get immersed in the world. And so I must be a munafiq. And Abu Bakr said, well, that happens to me as well. So now he started worrying that maybe he's a munafiq. So they go to the Prophet ﷺ and they tell him this, and the Prophet ﷺ says, if you didn't go out and make mistakes and make tawbah, the angels would be greeting you on the street, shaking your hands. You know, in other words, this is humanity. This is why you're a human being. And he said, you know, sa'a wa sa'a. There's a time for this and a time for that. And now this, unfortunately, on page 212 and the top of 213, this is just, I don't know why he's even mentioning that in there, because that is simply an unacceptable story in the seerah. And so everybody should just eliminate that, because it's just not true. The Prophet ﷺ, Zainab radiallahu anha bint Jahsh, she was 40 years old. He had known her all of her life in Mecca. He had an opportunity to marry her. He actually is the one who married her to Zayd. I mean, it's a completely insane idea that the Prophet ﷺ somehow, as one story goes, her veil flew up, which is not true because they weren't wearing face veils. So there's all these things that have slipped into the literature, and this is a really unfortunate one of those things about seerah. You get stories in there that should not be in there. Zainab was a Qurayshi noblewoman. The Quraysh did not believe that anyone amongst the Arab was akfa, except for the Quraysh. In other words, a Qurayshi should not marry other than a Qurayshi unless there was a very strong political motive. So they did sometimes marry women from other tribes for political alliances. They rarely married their women outside of the tribe. They really did feel that there was just no kafa'a there.